Welcome to Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
Good morning, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes on Everything Co-op this wonderful Thursday morning. You know, we're celebrating Black History Month, and NCBA CLUSA, National Cooperative Business Association, is celebrating their 100th year this year. You know, 100 years. They got started in 1916. 1916, a little bit before our time, but there are some folks around that's 100 years old or more, but for the most part, that's before our time. But we're going to talk about those times today with Dr. Jessica Gordon Nembhard. Dr. Jessica, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well, though. I seem to have a cough right now, but I'm fine. Thank you.
Well, take off anytime you want and get it straight, and I'll keep talking. You know, I looked up in 1916, a loaf of bread was $5 at the beginning of the year, and it went up, 5 cents. And then it was 7 cents at about September. It went up 40% in that 1 year, and a car was $300, a Model T. What else was going on about that time? Is it right before the Depression? What was happening particularly with co-ops in Black America? The book you wrote, Collective Courage, A History of African American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice. And one of the things you told me before was you didn't know it was that much history.
Right. When I started, I thought I'd spend a year or two trying to find some things. I'd find a few examples, and then I actually was going to move on to looking at Latinos and Native Americans and Asian Americans just to see what other subaltern groups' experiences were. But I actually still haven't gotten out of the African American experience because there's just so much there that we just didn't know. By 1915 or 1916, for example, 1916 actually happens to be the year that W.E.B. Du Bois starts the Negro Cooperative Guild. Or actually, he starts it in 1918, but he calls a meeting, the Amenia Economic Conferences in 1916, to start talking about economic differences and that kind of thing. He had already in 1907 had a conference at the University of Atlanta on Black businesses and co-op businesses, and had published a book in 1907 on African-American cooperatives called Economic Cooperation Among Negro Americans. So Du Bois was already heavy into his analysis of the economic crisis for African-Americans and the need for an alternative, and had been talking about the ways that African-Americans survived economically by using economic cooperation in a variety of forms. So that was going on. We had in 1915 the Pioneer Cooperative Society in Harlem, New York, which was basically a co-op food store, but also a group practicing cooperative economics in Harlem. We already had a couple of mutual insurance companies like North Carolina Mutual in Richmond, Virginia, and the Penny Savings Bank in Richmond. Sorry, North Carolina Mutual is obviously in North Carolina. I'm sorry. And the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank that was started by Maggie Lena Walker was in Richmond. So we had already a history, a practice of African Americans coming together and doing everything they needed in order to survive. And often what everything they needed to do was join together, pool their resources, and create something larger than any one person or family. And doing that, they were able to weather the storms. And this would have been, we were already talking about before the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, I assume we'll get to that, there's just a proliferation of African-American co-ops. First, as we said, just to survive, especially to survive the Depression. And then a realization that the structure is really an important structure, particularly for a marginalized group who's trying to figure out how to make it in a dominant world that doesn't really want them in the economy.
Don't want us to make it. Going back even further than that, I've gotten the sense that Native Americans, you mentioned them, and African Americans, that we brought these view, this sort of collective view of working together in tribes, that we brought this with us. This sort of was ingrained in us when we came over on the slave ships. Is that your sense also?
Yes. There's increasing evidence that cooperativism and collectivism, communalism was practiced in Africa. And actually, my sense is that it's really a survival mechanism that every group, every ethnic group, every nation has used and continues to use. But we certainly have research from African philosophers and people who studied African agriculture. And, of course, Africa is a huge continent, so I'm trying not to generalize. Certainly there were different nations and civilizations throughout Africa that probably were at different stages. But it seems that in almost every place, the connection between humanity, society, the land, even spirituality was all practiced collectively and in a way that was very much dignified, and the primacy was human dignity and human survival and human caring for each other. And I think we can say the same thing about people who have studied the culture and economics of Native Americans. But really, the Europeans also had their own practice, which is what dominates our understanding of co-ops in the U.S. So it's not to say that the other groups didn't also bring cooperativism to the U.S., but to just say that African Americans, like all the other groups, brought cooperativism from their own continent and then mixed it, combined it with what they were learning from what the Europeans brought, and then how the U.S. was creating its own set, its own mode of cooperative. So it's really a mixture, but recognizing that each group actually brings its own. When I first got into this field 20 years ago, there wasn't that recognition that every group brought a history and a legacy of co-ops. There was this notion that co-ops only came from the Europeans and only came out of the Rochdale movement in the 1844 in England, and that anything that was cooperative had to have those roots instead of recognizing the other, the cultural and economic roots from a myriad of civilizations around the world.
I was in Puerto Rico for National Association of Housing Co-ops conference, and we had a Puerto Ricanian give the keynote speech, and he went back to the 1400s talking about co-ops in Peru, and this whole sort of sense that, it came from all kinds of different places. Okay, so we have cooperativism coming from Africa and Latin America, Europe, all over. I think if we go to Asia, we could find it there.
I'm sure.
Okay.
And if we want to do U.S. history, in 1935, what was the name of the group? It was actually a Christian group, invited the foremost cooperative leader from Japan to Harlem to talk about cooperatives. And I'm going to mess up. I can't even remember his name right now. I'm sorry. I'm trying to quickly look it up. But anyway, just to show that there was even this synergy between what was happening around the world and recognizing that cooperativism was farther ahead of us in Japan at that time than it was here. And they brought him as kind of a motivational speaker. They launched some economic programs after that in Harlem. I think it was the Federation of Churches in Christ or something like that who brought him on a tour, and one of the places was Harlem, so that he could talk about how co-ops could be used. So it's just, as I said, it's interesting when you look back in the history isn't even monocultural, but what we remember, what we're taught is monoculturally taught.
My sense is that the Europeans will write things down, and then when they write it down, they claim, here's where it starts, the modern co-op.
Right, okay. Nothing else existed except what they wrote down.
Also, it reminds me that I had the opportunity and the privilege of going to the UN for the first time in 2011 to sell in the October-November timeframe, where the UN declared 2012 as a year of the cooperative. And I was blown away of what was going on in Russia, in China, in Japan, and Argentina, and all over the world, what was going on in co-ops. It seemed like it was more going on around the world than here in the U.S. Is that your sense at all, too?
Yeah, I think so. And, we actually talked about this last year when I was on. The U.S. is not that open, right, to alternative economics, right? We're pretty much under the influence of the domination of capitalism, and I don't think other countries are quite as, what would be the word?
Well, somebody said on the program once that we're in love with this capitalism. It's, the U.S.
And it's hegemonic in the U.S., which means it's so dominant that it doesn't really allow for any other things. Now, that doesn't mean we haven't had and we don't have a long co-op history here. It just means that it's not as big as other places and it's not as deep, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of it has been struggle to keep the co-ops open. A lot of it has been isolated, right? Co-ops just operating in isolated silos. However, and I can't hesitate to tell people that the co-op movement is not small in the U.S. Remember, some of our largest agricultural businesses are co-ops, like Land of Lakes and CHS and that kind of thing. So we actually do have a kind of hybrid economy. It's just that the co-op part of it is very much hidden and quiet and not seen as any major players. The other thing that's really interesting, if you go to the International Cooperative Alliance meetings, because we have such a large population, they give you delegates and voting power based on how many people in co-ops are in the National Co-op Association, right? So NCBA actually is one of the larger co-op associations in the world. So we have one of the higher numbers of delegates with voting power, even though per capita we have many fewer, or the percentage of our co-ops in our economy is much smaller than, say, Canada, which has like 30% of their economy is co-ops, or Italy, but they have much smaller populations.
Some of the lessons that you talked the last time is that many African-American leaders have articulated a cooperative economic development strategy.
Right.
But I guess in growing up in the 60s, I didn't hear that.
Right.
I haven't heard this, and nowhere in my formal education did I hear anything about co-ops. But also, it's interesting going back reading your book and seeing how prevalent it has been even in the 60s.
Right.
So could you talk a little bit about what happened in the cooperative world during the civil rights movement?
Yes. So one of the things I found, and I had known a little bit about especially some of the Black Panther programs, and John Curl, who's a co-op historian, in his books, especially his, my brain is really dying. I can't remember the name of his book.
How you spelling Curl? John?
Curl, John Curl.
Okay.
Okay, I'll think of the name of the book later. But anyway, he actually does a great job of giving us a little bit of history from all the different ethnic groups in the U.S. involved in co-ops, especially worker co-ops. And so he's actually documented a lot of the Black Panther stuff. So I didn't bother to do, I used a lot of his research. But basically what we know is that if you look at any of the national civil rights organizations, and even probably a lot of local ones, they were practicing cooperative economics, even though their public face and the things they were talking about publicly were usually about civil political rights. Now, the Panthers, of course, were more radical, so they weren't just focused on voting rights and political rights. But they still didn't really talk about their economics. They mostly talked about self-defense. They had their health clinics. They had their children's programs. They talked about history and teaching children history and African American studies, that kind of thing.
But Dr. Jessica, we have to take a break.
Okay.
We have to take our first break, and we'll come back and talk about the Black Panthers and other leaders and their role with co-ops and economic development. We'll be right back. Don't touch the dial.
1450 WOL.
Welcome back. This is Vernon Oakes on Everything Co-op. We have Dr. Jessica Gordon Nembhard with us this morning, talking about history. She's written a book, Collective Carriage, A History of African-American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice. You were talking about the Black Panthers before we left and other leaders and how they have encouraged cooperative business. Could you continue with that conversation?
Yes, and I did remember John Curl's book. It's called For All the People.
Okay.
And I apologize to John Curl for messing it up earlier. Anyway, that's also a fabulous book that people should be reading if you're interested in this area. And it's not just about African Americans in the co-op movement, but it's the whole U.S. co-op movement. So the Civil Rights era, the Black Panthers in particular, I was saying, were practicing cooperative economics, even though that wasn't what they were talking most strongly about. Though if you look at their 10-point platform, they do talk about being socialist. But their actual economic practices were mostly collective, sometimes informal collectives, and sometimes more formal cooperatives. Like they had a collective shoe factory, a cooperative bakery. Their health clinics were basically run as cooperatives, so they gave free health care. That's one that people really never talk about, though a woman just wrote a book on that. And, of course, I'm not going to remember the name, but what I remember that she told us was when she went to the main library at Berkeley, which has a lot of the Panther files, and this would have been about 2 or 3 years ago, she was told she was the first person who ever asked to see the pictures of the Black Panther doctors and clinics. That everybody, the only thing people ever asked them for before were the pictures of the formations with the guns and maybe a picture of the free breakfast program. But nobody ever asked for the pictures in the collection of the health care programs and seeing Panthers who were doctors and service providers and that kind of thing. So a lot of this, for some reason, part of it, I guess, was what they thought was most important to present, but also part of it was they were doing the cooperative economics both as a way to survive so they could keep doing what they needed to do politically without being under the thumb of other people in their economic sphere, right? So instead of working for white people and then getting retaliated against because they were a Panther, they were creating their own economics. But also because of all the red baiting and anti-communist rhetoric in the 50s and early 60s, it really wasn't profitable for African Americans to talk about cooperatives and doing cooperation. Andrew Young actually talks about that in his autobiography, I believe, that it was really, you just talked about civil rights, right? That was the thing that people could rally around, that if you wanted to talk about economic justice, you got a lot less agreement, and then it was also much more dangerous because that's where they would try to stop you. And, of course, we even see that with Martin Luther King, right? The minute he starts talking about a poor people's campaign and economics, he's assassinated. So
it's amazing.
We don't talk about it that much, but then, you know, even groups like SNCC, they were doing agricultural co-ops and credit unions and other co-ops all throughout the South. That was actually their day-to-day community organizing, even when they were trying to do voter rights and that kind of thing. And it's the same with pretty much any of the organizations. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no. I thought you had finished, because it's amazing once you start talking about economics, how it would arouse people. They don't want us in the economic sphere. They don't want us to own our own businesses, our own stores, our own towns. And the whole sense of slavery for me was all economic based.
Right.
Free labor.
Right. They pretend that it wasn't. They pretend it was paternalism and that African peoples couldn't handle their own economics and that kind of thing. So, yeah, it is one of the strongholds, and it's internalized, right? So that even African Americans either believe that we can't do economics or make our own economic decisions, or we're afraid to talk about it because we know the consequences are so bad. And, you know, again, that's partly why the book was called Collective Courage, because it took a lot of courage and persistence to continue to do alternative economics, particularly cooperative economics, in the face of both the ideological and the economic and the physical sabotage and anti-co-op sensitivity. The other thing I did want to say while we were talking about the 60s and the civil rights organizations, the other thing that all the civil rights organizations did, the five major ones, SNCC, NAACP, CORE, Urban League, and can't remember what the fifth one was, they created the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, which is a regional organization in the South to promote cooperative economic development among low-income farmers and people of color, particularly African Americans. They came together at a meeting back in '65, I believe, and put together a grant that got funded by both Ford Foundation and the U.S. Department of Commerce, I believe. I think one of the economic opportunity grants. And those two grants are what started the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. So again, those civil rights groups didn't make a big deal about it. Nobody really announced that they did this. But they realized at the same time they were working for voting rights and other civil rights, they needed to help figure out what was going to be a viable strategy for economic survival and economic democracy. So again, these little pieces that we don't think of or we don't know about, but that are important fabric in our society, in our history, and an important partnership in the civil rights movement.
You know, Ralph Page, who had been the executive director of there for, I don't know, it feels like since the beginning of time, and Cornelius Blaney is their current executive director, who took over in March of last year. Both have been on the program. We've had a couple other people on the program. Because the knowledge and what they're doing, land, I didn't even know that blacks owned that much land. And
we used to own more, but
a lot more. I think
they're helping us to continue to own, right?
So, and I did not know that these 5 groups came together to help to form that. Going back to your title, your book, Collective Courage, I get that courage is doing what you know you need to do, even though you're scared to death, scared.
Yep.
Okay. And then if we can do it as a group, collectively, we have a better chance of success, even in spite of lynching and whether people are literally taking a rope and lynching you by the neck or lynching you economically.
Right.
But this voter right thing, what I wanted to do today is try to talk about the history and then relate it to today so we can see what kind of future we might have if we take the lessons from the history and apply them today in places like Flint, Michigan, or in this political season for the president. This whole sense of voter right is, you know, I was born in 1947, so in the early 60s, I was in junior high and high school, graduated from high school in 1965. And we had that little bitty round TV that was a lot of snow, what we used to call it, because you could barely see it, black and white.
Right.
And we'd see all of these pictures. And I grew up in Bluefield, West Virginia, so it was, you know, going to Atlanta would have been, or even D.C. was like going to, I don't know, Ghana today. It was just like
it was far.
Almost impossible. So we'd see these pictures, and it was always voter rights. It seemed like it was the main fight. It wasn't the fight for economics as much and to the poor people's piece, but all in the early 60s, it was voter rights, and it seemed like we don't get that today, at least people, Americans particularly, just in particular African Americans. How can we get more people to learn about that and get people out to vote?
Right. Well, there's so much to say. First of all, I just want to say quickly, I'm going to get off the topic for 1 second because you said you were from Bluefields, West Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope you noticed in the book that there was, in the 1920s, there was a co-op at the Bluefields Colored Institute. There was a co-op supply store and a students' co-op. And that group actually was the Cooperative Society of Bluefield Colored Institute. Actually was the first black organization to join CLUSA, and they joined in 1926. So you actually, you know, your hometown is a place. And in fact, the manager of that co-op supply store, which was run by the students, actually wrote articles about how important co-ops were to the black community in the Crisis magazine, and took his students to a CLUSA conference.
Jesus, I missed it. I missed that in your book.
Well, it's there. Look up Bluefields in the index. I believe it's in the index. Anyway, you'll see. So your little town is on the map in this book.
What's amazing to me is how circled this is, that I never knew anything about co-ops. I went to Bluefield State. Grew up in Bluefield, West Virginia, went to Bluefield State, graduated, and, you know, went on to Penn State and then Stanford, and only got this about 20 years ago, and found out this always goes back, and we have to take our next break. We'll come back and talk about this voter rights and more into this economics with Dr. Jessica Nembhard. Please stay with us. If you have any questions or comments, you can call in at 1-800-450-7876, 1-800-450-7876. We'll be right back.
1450 WOL.
Welcome back, everybody. We have on the line with us Dr. Jessica Gordon Nembhard, who has written a book, Collective Courage, A History of African American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice. And earlier on, she said that these co-ops were used as a method of surviving, particularly during the Great Depression. And we were talking before we took the break about voter rights. We were going to get ready to to talk about voter rights. So how does voter rights, I know that the second principle of co-ops is democratic
participation, right? One person, one vote.
And I've gotten on this program for the last 2.5 years now. We're only going to do it for a month. So we've been on for 2.5 years, and over again, it says the people that are in co-ops, they really get it about the democratic participation, and not only do they participate in the co-ops, but they go out into the world, into their communities, and participate.
Yeah.
The question was, how do we get more people to understand the importance of this participation?
Right. So history of the voting rights campaign is actually bittersweet because technically the civil rights groups hit upon voting rights because JFK, John F. Kennedy, our president at the time in the early 60s, actually begged black groups to focus on voting rights and not to fight for too many other rights because he thought it was going to be too divisive and too problematic. So the groups made a sort of pact with him to focus on voting rights and civil rights. Again, it was looked upon as something that would be more palatable, that people could rally around and that whites could also connect with and support. So that's why I said it's kind of a conflictual thing. While we all agree and we need voting rights, and you're right, democratic participation, which is what we get in the co-op model, is so important. I think I'll come at it from two different ways. I'll come at it from the Fannie Lou Hamer way. And Fannie Lou Hamer in Mississippi in the 60s was a SNCC member and a voting rights advocate. In fact, she did voting rights training. She did voter registration drives. And then she came to co-ops afterwards. But one of the reasons she talked about coming to the co-op movement after the voting rights movement is she said it was too hard even to do voting rights. If you remember anything about Fannie Lou Hamer, after she registered to vote, and I think on her way back from giving a voter registration training, she was arrested and beaten almost to death, right? She lost a kidney and hearing in one ear because of how badly she was beaten. And she said that it's not enough for us to just fight for our civil rights. We actually have to control our own economy, because they can retaliate against us if we only are asking for voting rights, right? She was a sharecropper. She also, not only was she beaten almost to death, but she lost her farm that she and her husband were sharecropping. She came home from registering to vote, and all her things were out in the street. And the farmer said she and her husband couldn't sharecrop there anymore because they didn't want any uppity black person. So she talked about how if we don't have cooperative ownership, if we don't own our own land, have our own gardens, create our own food, we're, trying to fight for our civil rights isn't going to go very far because we don't have the economic independence and we don't have control of our own economies. So she kind of ended up turning things on its head. Yes, we have to participate in the political life because that also is where most of the decisions are made. But we have to come to that struggle from a position of at least some kind of stability and economic control. And she started Freedom Farm, which was a large cooperative farm that also helped to establish affordable housing, some worker co-ops with women sewers, a Head Start program and child care. So she had a whole comprehensive view of what needed to surround activists and people in general so that we could survive. And then she said from that kind of position of strength, she thought we should go out and fight for our rights. The other way I wanted to come at it is to talk about, as you hinted, that people who are involved in cooperative economics tend to be more civically engaged because being involved in a cooperative economic relationship means you have that economic and governance participation, that one person, one vote. It doesn't matter how much money you bring to it, you get your vote equally with anybody else. You have transparency, right? Cooperatives, everybody, in order to do that joint governance, everyone has to understand the finances and be able to read the books. People need to understand the business and how it runs, right? So you have all kinds of education, training, information, sharing of information, transparency, et cetera, that comes out of a co-op. Well, you don't just spend 8 to 10 hours a day in that kind of a situation and not apply it to the rest of your life. So this way, we know that, in fact, there's some research, though we're trying to do more about it, the ways that people who are involved in cooperative economics also are better citizens, are more active and participatory in the rest of their lives, and understand the importance of voice, participation, democracy, and how it can really be wielded.
Well, what first attracted me to co-ops was this fifth principle, which you're talking about, education, training, and information. That has to happen. It has to be at the core of the business model that people have to understand. And I think in the food co-ops, and a lot of them, you have to pass a financial test in order to be on the board.
And the worker co-ops, most of them do open book management, and they have to learn to read financial sheets and talk about finance and that kind of thing.
Well, I grew up in math, and so that's the only thing I could read early on. Words escaped me. But so reading the numbers is extremely important. I've since learned that the words are important also. So this whole sense of education, that's what came out of your book, too, and that how important this need for education is. Continuing importance of education, internal to the co-op and external.
Right. And I think we talked about it last year, too, but I can't say it enough, right? The internal and external. So, right, first we need just public education about the model, because as we've been talking about, you don't hear about it. You don't know about it. Even when groups are practicing it, they're not, proclaiming it from the hilltops, right? They're trying to keep it quiet under the radar so they don't get disturbed or sabotaged. So the very first thing is just to make sure, as you said, with this station and other ways, to make sure people understand the model, talk about the model, understand what it is, all the principles, how it operates, that kind of thing. The second thing is that once you're in a co-op, or actually even before you finish incorporating your co-op, there needs to be a whole panoply of orientation and training about the model, how it works in your specific industry, how your particular co-op is going to work. I learned that actually from the worker co-op movement, how important it is from day one of getting people thinking about forming a co-op. And I think that most of the other co-ops do it too, the housing co-ops, the food co-ops. People have to be taught and talked to about the strengths and weaknesses of the model, the elements of the model, what those 7 principles are and how you operate them in an economic structure, what your industry is and understanding your industry and understanding the finances. And so we can't underestimate how important the initial training and then continuous training is, because otherwise you can't really be a democratic participant in the governance of your business if you don't, right? If you don't understand, and so we're learning that the programs that can do the best job of that education and training and then continue it as they're running their businesses, the stronger the co-op is. And as I told you last time, one of the really interesting findings from my book was that pretty much every co-op, at least every African-American co-op I found, started with some kind of study group, a study circle, a study group, something. If we go back to your Bluefields group, that was already at a black school. They started teaching about cooperatives and talking to the students about cooperatives, and then helped them to start their own co-op business, and then connected them to the larger co-op movement in the U.S. If you look at a group in Gary, Indiana in the 30s, which I think we already talked about, they actually started a course in the high school, in the night school part of the black high school during the Great Depression, to introduce the notion of co-ops and to train people so that then they could start the co-ops that the society was trying to do in gas station, credit union, and grocery store. If you look at, as I said, really any of the co-ops I can mention, they all started with people coming together. What's our problem? What's the solution? And then how do we start a co-op and how do we maintain a co-op?
So problem and then solution I got early on is that co-ops solve community problems. Matter of fact, one gentleman, Papa Sen, said if there's no problem, there's no need for a co-op.
Right.
But the other part, and I think I told you this before, is that in my property management business, we're in the process of turning it over to the employees and making it a worker-owned co-op. And I thought it would take about 3 months. Well, we've been studying now for a year. Okay. Yep. And the other ones is how you make decisions together is what we've been wrestling with as a group.
That's a huge one.
And then the conflict resolution.
Yeah.
I had a lady, Ruthie Wilder, from housing co-op in D.C. In Baltimore. She's the president up there, and she was saying that what she learned in this co-op movement, it helped her in her life.
Right.
We've already talked about that. But she worked for the transit system up in Baltimore. Mm. I thought she was saying conflict resolution within her family or with her man. She learned how to resolve conflict. She said, no, I learned how to do budgeting and save money and take care of my money. Okay. Right. But it's all of those kinds of things that I find interesting about what one learns as an adult. And for people out there listening, you don't have to have high school education. You definitely don't have a doctorate education or anywhere in between there. What you need is desire to get your life in order and where you have control over your life, and then come learn. And the other thing I've learned is that when you go to co-op meetings, people really share. They don't have. There's no sort of holding back information. Girl, what did you do when blah? And they just answer the questions. Yeah. And that gets to the question you've learned that a lot of the co-ops was a strong word with black women. As a matter of fact, women, period, in the co-op movement, but specifically we're talking about African Americans. So why would you suggest, or why do you think there was such a strong role for black women in the co-op movement?
Right. And just to finish about the sharing, the other thing I found was a lot of the co-ops would visit each other so they could talk about how they solved this problem or how they did this or that. So especially around the 30s and 40s, you find that one co-op went and studied the co-op, the co-op in D.C. went and studied the co-op in Gary and in Richmond and in Chicago or whatever, and the co-op in St. Louis went and studied, so there was all this sharing, as you said, of information, not just within the co-op members, but across co-ops. Some of that was because there were organizations that were encouraging it, and sometimes it was just that the people who were creating it realized they didn't want to reinvent the wheel, right? They wanted to learn from each other. Fascinating about black women's role in the co-op movement and in African-American cooperatives. Some of the women, and I want to name some of the women we know well from other areas, and some of the women we never heard of before. So an unsung hero would be Helena Wilson, who is president of the Ladies Auxiliary to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. We know the Brotherhood, right? The first official independent black labor union organized and run by A. Philip Randolph. But the Ladies Auxiliary were the women members of the union and the wives of the union members. And their president, she was president for about 35 years. She was a co-op advocate. She studied cooperatives. She wrote about it in the Black Worker, their magazine. She started cooperatives, especially in Chicago, her hometown. Very influential, even though we never heard about her, but she was sort of the backbone behind the other projects of the Brotherhood that weren't about the actual union organizing.
We have to take our next break. You're going to go Ella Jo Baker?
About to talk about Ella Jo Baker, but we can do that when we come back.
We'll come back and talk about her and some others. We know her name, and some others like Helena Wilson I did not know. So we'll be back to talk more about the cooperative movement in the past and how it will relate to our future. Please don't touch your dial. We'll be right back.
1450 WOL.
Information is power, and that's why the National Cooperative Bank is sponsoring this program. This is Vernon Oakes, bringing you information about co-ops. It's called Everything Co-op, and Dr. Jessica Gordon Nembhard is our expert in the history of co-ops. You're talking about black women, Ella Jo Baker.
Yeah, right. And, of course, March is Women's History Month, so I'm sort of trying to wrap up Black History Month and usher in Women's History Month. But, Ella Jo Baker, again, we know her mostly because of SNCC. She was an advisor, actually a co-founder and advisor to SNCC in the 60s. She brought young people together because she felt that they were important in the civil rights movement and that it shouldn't just be run by the older folks. And she also, as we know, she used to work for the NAACP as a field organizer and had kind of honed their grassroots leadership development model and grassroots organizing model. What we don't know as much, though hopefully now more and more people know about this, one of Ella Jo Baker's first jobs after college was she was executive director of the Young Negroes Cooperative League in the 1930s. And I have been arguing that she really learned most of what she later practiced about grassroots organizing and grassroots leadership development and the importance of young people in the civil rights movement from her years in the Young Negro Cooperative League, not just applying the co-op principles, but also the notion for the Young Negroes Cooperative League was that young people should be running the movement. In this case, they were talking about the movement for economic justice. Mm-hmm. And to promote cooperatives throughout the country. They had a huge, grandiose plan for having cooperatives in every city and regional co-ops and regional factories feeding into the local co-ops and national conferences. In fact, at the first national conference where she was officially elected executive director, they had 600 people in Pittsburgh. And she made a speech about the role of women and the importance of women in the co-op movement at that conference. So she was very much aware, one, of the power of women as organizers, and then the importance of women and young people as being the ones who kind of were in the forefront of this movement. And then, of course, how important cooperative economics, even though the Young Negroes Cooperative League only lasted about 3 or 4 years, it was formative in terms of bringing all those people together, getting cooperative notion out, getting a sense that young people really needed to be movers and shakers in this movement. So Ella's one of my, she's one of my heroes in this whole thing. But I can't talk about women and be in D.C., or you guys are in D.C., mm-hmm. and not talk about Nannie Helen Burroughs, who mostly D.C. people know. When I go out in the world, most other people except the Baptists don't really know who Nannie Helen Burroughs is. But in D.C., we know her. Hopefully we know her. Yes. At M Street School, she started the Negro Women and Girls Training School, which then became the M Street School. And, of course, we have named a street after her in Deanwood, where she had the school and where she lived. But she also was a cooperator. She started the Cooperative Industries of D.C. with women. Again, this would be 1930s, 1935, 36, 37. Women who were making almost no money or were unemployed, she pulled them together to make brooms and mattresses in their own worker co-ops. And then they branched out, actually, into an agricultural co-op because she was able to tap into a major grant from FDR's self-help co-op division in the Department of Commerce. And once she got that grant, she spent it on buying a farm the co-op spent it in buying mm-hmm. a farm in Maryland. And they were bringing fresh produce into D.C., still, in the middle, I guess, of what we call the Great Depression. And she was also a spokesperson for the co-op movement. She actually attended the meetings of the District of Columbia Co-op Society, which was part of CLUSA, and there are letters in her files showing where CLUSA members were inviting her to go speak about co-ops all around D.C. and sometimes other places in the country. So even the mainstream co-op society saw her as a co-op spokesperson. And so she had a strong role, especially in the D.C. area around that. And then pretty much if you look at, we've got Fannie Lou Hamer, who we already mentioned. If you look at a lot of the co-op documents, like the group in Gary that I keep talking about, Cooperative Trading Association in Gary, Indiana in the 30s, they had a women's guild that basically kept the co-op going for the years that it was going, and that co-op is known well because its food co-op was the largest black grocery store in the country at its time in 1936. In the 60s, right, you think about the women behind the men. So the men still kind of were the leaders or seen as the leaders, but the women were doing a lot of the work. Okay. So a group like Freedom Quilting Bee, which was a founding member of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, were sharecropping women who came together to quilt, were able to buy their own factory, buy land, create child care programs for their children, provide extra land for sharecroppers who got thrown off their properties for registering to vote, to give them a chance to regroup and get their own land. So lots of ways that women were instrumental in both keeping the co-ops together, doing the co-op education that was needed to do, and also stabilizing their communities.
It's like, how do we take these lessons and apply them today? Flint, Michigan has a lot of problems.
Yep.
And listening, they don't have a grocery store, would be what we call a food desert today. So how can we get these lessons to the folks at Flint to see if they can come together and solve their own problems? If they can, one of the values of co-ops is self-help,
right?
Self-responsibility,
pooling your resources, figuring out what resources you have. It's not always money, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's like 6 other different kinds of capital. So pulling together all those different capitals, pulling together your resources, and then leveraging what you've pulled together to do what you need to do is also important. So, a place like Flint, one, they just need to know that this model exists and the flexibility of this model, right, for what it can do for you. I mean, there's lots of different, if water is their first problem, then at the same time that they're suing their government for, poisoning their water, they also need to be figuring out a water co-op, right? I know right now what I've heard in the news is that, they've got charities giving them water, and somebody in the family has to go each day and
pick it up,
stock up on the water, right? But it seems like maybe if they got together some kind of water buying club or something, or even if they don't have to buy the water, even a club to distribute the water that's free, right? So that it wasn't so debilitating just picking up the water every day and you didn't need a car in order to get your water, right? Because I worry about the people who didn't even have a car. How do they go to the distribution places and get their water, right? So thinking about what those needs are and then how you can work together. If you remember the Montgomery boycott, right, bus boycott, right, not everybody had a car for the boycott. Most people walked, but then they started sharing cars and using collective taxi systems and that kind of thing. So thinking about those kind of ways to share resources. Also, definitely, I think, sorry, the thought just jumped out of my head, but I guess I was thinking about not just water co-ops, but others. Oh,
I'm thinking the
food desert, right. We have some really great models now, starting with Greensboro, North Carolina, on low-income Black communities putting together a food co-op and piecing together some money from the municipality with other private supports and some non-predatory lending. And they're in Greensboro, after I think it's 25 or 30 years, they're finally, hopefully this spring, opening a Black-owned food co-op. And we've got, I think, a couple other places in North Carolina, like Durham, are starting to do it. I know they're looking into it in Roxbury, Boston. And there's a group of us who are trying to put together the groups from around the country who are doing this so that they could share best practices, share challenges and solutions to challenges, and then also maybe create materials that were much more user-friendly to Black, right? Because that's one of the complaints is that we don't have great materials that show how Black people have done it or how low-income people have done it. And so we need to create some of those materials so that Black people feel like their situation is reflected in the educational and development materials.
Well, I called the mayor of Flint, and I did not get through. And it's interesting, she's a female, and there's a community college that's run by a female that was here in D.C., and so I know her through church, and so I'm trying to reach out to some folks up there to get them this information and to see who might be interested in it. I only have a minute and a half or so to go, so can you talk a little bit about the presidential election and what we want people to go and do? But I've also found that the off-presidential elections are all as important, if not more important, because those are the local people that make the decisions about what happens in your city or your county or whatever. So the elections are so extremely important to get the right person in. There's a book out, and you know about it, Cities Building Community Wealth by the Democracy Collaborative.
Yeah.
And that's what they talk about.
Yeah.
You are a co-founder of that?
Okay. Democracy Collaborative, yes.
Okay.
So I was going to talk about the work I've been doing with the Southern Grassroots Economies Project and with One DC here in DC. And in those projects, we're working with or trying to work with municipalities, particularly local governments with One DC and with state and even federal government with this Southern Grassroots Economies Project. And what we're trying to do there is get enabling legislation and local funding put toward co-op development. Well, first just the co-op education and then co-op development.
We got to stop there.
It's really important that we have the right people in those government positions, right, in our city governments, in our state governments, and, of course, in our national governments who understand or care, right, about real community development and understand that the co-op model can be something that can be used. Some states don't even have laws. I'm sorry,
but we got to go, and I want to have you back on again. And thank you so very much. You have a lot of information, great information.
Thank you. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Thank you. Bye now.
1450 WOL.